every time I come and I see people, I am like surprised and delighted. And I am catching this introductory conversation. And in that light, we're going to look at Psalm 23, but we're specifically going to look at a verse that deals with justice. And it's a remarkable verse because it's one I overlooked. And in light of this moment and the protests in the street, it's a surprise for me to see embedded in Psalm 23 this reference to justice. As some of you know, in looking at the Psalms, I take the opportunity to study them closely, often focusing on the artistry of the Psalter, repetition of words and bridges. And I will do a little of that between today and tomorrow. But today, I'm going to be focusing on one verse. And I'll tell you about my choice of translation. But I want to give context. Psalm 23 is the best known of all the Psalms. It's the psalm we say at graveside, usually. Literally, when I get a handout these days from Pacific View or Harbor Lawn, there's only one reading, Psalm 23, that we do together. Interestingly, it's not just the psalm identified with funerals. In many communities, it was said before every meal, particularly before the motzi. I had the privilege to do a funeral for a congregant family, and the patriarch was over 100 years old from Persia. He was limited already in his speech, but on prompting, he recited for me Psalm 23, word by word. So Psalm 23 is the best known chapter in the Bible. And toward that significance, we're going to spend both today and tomorrow looking at it closely. It's even more remarkable in that we've had some pretty long Psalms already, 51 verses, but this is only 6 verses, and it's packed. It's structured kind of like a storyboard in that Psalm 23, more than most Psalms, is a movement, it's a journey that takes us along a variety of images. Let me read my translation, and then I will talk about particularly the first half of the psalm today, and then the second half tomorrow. But I want to give an overview first. So a reading, as there are multiple opportunities for translation. And I read as follows. A Psalm of David. Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not lack. In grassy pastures, God lets me lie down alongside tranquil waters, leads me. My spirit, God revives, guiding me on roundabouts of justice for the sake of the divine name. For though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no harm, for you stand with me. Your identifying rod and your sustaining staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me opposite my enemies. You luxuriate my head with oil. My cup overflows. Let only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I will find Sabbath in the home of Adonai for unending days. Now, I highlighted in this translation, in my exploration of this psalm, the things that were, if you will, variant from the normal translation. And we'll come back to looking at those choices. But let me begin at the top and talk about the flow of this psalm. And again, our key focus today will be verse 3. And I'll let you know as we go deeper into it. But first, the three images. There are, if you will, three stops along the way. Verse 2, as we're in grassy pastures along tranquil waters. Verse 4, walking through the shadow of death with God alongside of us. 3, eating a meal before our enemies. And 4th, which in many ways is where we are going in this short psalm, is we are seeking to be in God's home, God's house, Sabbath-like. So 4, I should say, 4 key images in 6 verses. And then we have again verse 3. Let's start from the top. A Psalm of David, Adonai is my shepherd. Now, shepherd is a key motif in the Bible. Our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were shepherds. Jacob's sons, as they come to Egypt, they are shepherds, as is King David. And so even before agriculture, we as a people were identified with the task of guiding sheep or guiding goats. The images the rabbis will use for how is it that Moses, for instance, was chosen to be God's leader is that the rabbis imagine that Moses was a kind shepherd. And as he treated each shepherd with care, so it was that God said, you have the qualities of character to guide my people. In fact, the burning bush, as the rabbis imagine, how is it that Moses is alone in the desert? Because he has a whole flock. And the image is one of the sheep went astray. And Moses, for Moses, the shepherd, every sheep mattered. And so Moses went off to find this lost sheep. And it was precisely in that act of caregiving that Moses encountered God, that Moses encountered the bush that burned and was not consumed. And so to begin with, the image of shepherd is a biblical core motif, and God as shepherd conveys that each of us matters. This psalm has 17 references for I, me, or my, meaning I, the psalter, as an individual, am dear to God. God is my shepherd. God counts every sheep. And then, lo echsar, I shall not lack, is, if you will, another title for the entire psalm. What is a mindset of not lacking is to be content with what one has. Pirkei Avot will say, Ben Zoma, mi ashir, who is wealthy? Misha samech bechalko, the one who is content, happy with his or her portion. And so here the Psalter already reveals his mindset, which is by having God as his shepherd, he lacks for nothing. For ultimately, it is that quality of caregiving of God that is what matters, which will be again the envelope to verse 6. Verse 6, the final verse, which is all I seek, is to find Sabbath in the home of Adonai. For if God is my shepherd, I shall not lack. And now verse 2, in grassy pastures, God leads me down. Alongside tranquil waters leads me. Here, verse 2 is an image of calm. There's a beautiful book, an entire book by Harold Kushner, written in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, called The Lord is My Shepherd. This book that came out in 2003 uses this psalm as a way of responding to the fear that came in the aftermath of terrorism, and did so with a whole book on just these 6 verses, every chapter a verse. And Rabbi Kushner, the conservative rabbi of Natick, Mass, will point out that in verse 2, the colors of blue and green of the grassy pastures and the tranquil waters convey calm, in contrast to reds and yellows which excite. He emphasizes that the blues and the greens calm. This is a psalm of comfort. And then there is this verse 3, that's very much on my mind because it's a remarkable verse. First, let me tell you how verse 3 sounds in the King James. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. In fact, Harold Kushner will add in his translation, he restores my soul. He guides me in straight paths for his name's sake. As if this expression, v'ma'agle tzedek, so he leads me, second half of verse 3, b'ma'agle tzedek, here Harold Kushner translates as straight paths for the sake of his name, as if the goal and the trust in the shepherd is that the shepherd is not failing to take care of our needs. It's a straight path. And yet Rabbi Kushner was the one who pointed out that the Hebrew is more complicated. The Hebrew, an ma'agal, an agalah, is that which is round. It's a roundabout. He leads me on roundabouts of justice. And mind you, I translated this 2 weeks ago. And you'll see why I'm emphasizing that in terms of this moment of justice, making and seeking. L'ma'an shemo, for the sake of the divine name. Now, I want to pause to talk about how one reads scripture. The rabbis say that all scripture is to be read on 4 levels, and the rabbis use the acronym pardes. Pshat is, if you will, the physical level, the what's in front of you level. Remez is the emotional level, drash kind of an intellectual play, and sod an intuitive understanding. Let me read you a couple more translations. First, Rabbi Martin Cohen. So he reads, I'll get a head start, verse 2, and who leads me to calm waters, to restore my spirit, now verse 3, who walks me in level pastures as befits a shepherd of sound reputation. Now you can see how he's reading verse 3 very much to be about the task of the shepherd, not unlike the straight paths. It's the physical level, the imagining, which is actually an interpretation too. Those aren't the exact words. Frankly, I think mine are the more exact words. You will get the following as a commentary. The early medieval commentators, Radak from Spain and France, and Ibn Ezra from Spain says, the considerate shepherd will not fatigue his sheep by taking them on difficult, roundabout routes. Rather, he leads them on the straightest, easiest path, as if somehow V'magle Tzedek is a straight path. But that's not the Hebrew, at least in its normal reading. And what is justice instead of straight? Tzedek there is like straight, you shall pursue, right? Tzedek tirdof. But that's not exactly the case. And now, because I'm with always an eye on the clock, and an eye on the news, I want to say how this verse so deeply touches me on this day. So verse 2, we have God as shepherd, taking me to a calm place. And my spirit, nafshi, my soul, my life, God revives. But this next clause seems to me to be essential. Because if God revives us, what does God revive us for? Toward? If you will, what's the purpose? Guides me on roundabouts of justice. Now I'm going to do a little interpretation. And that is, roundabouts means that justice sometimes doesn't move in a straight line. There has to be a lot of processing. So here's Rabbi Kushner at the end of the chapter on this verse. We often find that God miraculously shortened the, no, not that one. That's a different one. One second. When we speculate on the paths our lives have taken and all the good things that have come our way, some of which we could never have anticipated, let us pause to thank God for leading us on roundabout paths to end up where we were meant to be. And so he is astutely aware that this is a roundabout, not a straight path. Ma'agle, the tzedek, of justice, for the sake of his name. What does that mean? He's leading us on paths for the sake of his name. Let me read now a little bit from this book that I delighted in. I read it many years ago. And it has to do with justice. So much on my mind. This is again on the chapter dedicated to verse 3. Does it really matter who gets the credit for the Exodus? Isn't the important thing that the slaves go free? In fact, it matters a great deal. Had Pharaoh let the slaves go when Moses first asked him to, without all those plagues, perhaps because they were no longer as useful economically as they had been years earlier, perhaps because, like his predecessor in Joseph's time, he had a dream about the downtrodden rising up against him, the lesson would have been that the well-being of the oppressed depends on the benevolence of the ruler. The ruler decides whether people will be slaves or free. But because Pharaoh insisted on holding on to his slaves as plague after plague rained down on his country, the moral of the story is that freedom for all is the will of God, even if powerful rulers oppose it. Compare the biblical story of the Exodus to another account of slaves being freed. 140 years ago, the United States was bitterly divided over the question of slavery. Strange as it may seem today, some justified it on scriptural grounds, others on grounds of economic necessity. Some called for its abolition for economic reasons, the invention of new machinery, the proliferation of small farms instead of large plantations had made slavery less necessary. Other voices insisted that even if slave owners benefited from owning slaves, it was morally and religiously wrong for one human being to own another. Did it make a difference which line of reasoning inspired the abolitionist cause? I believe it did. For one thing, people are more likely to fight and to risk their lives for deeply held ideals than for what is profitable. God wins over Marx every time. For another, if slavery was wrong because it was no longer financially advantageous, does that mean it was right when it made financial sense? Would it be right again should financial circumstances change? The struggle against the enslavement of one human being by another, whether fought in 19th century America or in ancient Egypt, was justified because slavery is wrong. It is wrong in all generations and in all economic circumstances. The freedom and dignity of every person of every race and gender is not a gift dispensed by a benevolent ruler. It is a blessing each of us received from our Creator. This is what the Bible is saying when it declares that the Exodus must be seen as God's doing, not Pharaoh's. Quote, for the sake of God's great name, freeing the enslaved must be seen as an aspect of what kind of God he is and what kind of world he demands, not what kind of man and king Pharaoh is. So those words by Harold Kushner, written almost 20 years ago in reference to verse 3, is a surprise for me. It's a surprise because it's a reminder of the relevance of Torah and picking up this psalm as our study today. Yes, God is our shepherd, saying that we are of infinite value to God and giving us the promise of that caregiving that we will not lack. We are to feel calmed by that. Grassy pastures, God's steady guiding presence along blue, tranquil waters, and we are thereby revived. But when we are guided, and again, it's, we have God, Yenahaleni, and here, Yancheni, similar words of guiding. But the purpose of God's guiding us is for the sake of justice, for the sake of doing justice, because that's what God expects from us. Not because of economic realities, not because of physical fears, but because of moral right and wrong. Seems to be the bridge. And here's what Robert Alter writes. Now Robert Alter, in his translation, seeking to give a more literary reading. But here's what he says of verse 3 and this phrase, which he translates, pathways of justice. With this phrase, the speaker glides from the sheep metaphor to speaking of himself in human terms. For there's a shift, because verse 4 is an adult, not a passive sheep, not a child. Some see this as different phases of life, where in the beginning a parent provides all the needs of the babe. And then there's an adulthood where you're sitting at your table. And then there is a greater spiritual understanding of what really matters. That's part of this journey that includes going through the dangers of the darkness of the valley. But the transition of what it means to be a baby and what it means to be an adult is this phrase, Tzedek Lama'an Shemo, righteousness for the sake of his name. That's at the very center here as the transition to adulthood, both literary bridge, but more an emotive bridge, an intellectual bridge, and an intuitive bridge. That the purpose of the shepherd is more than simply eating and drinking. You might think that it's simply tranquility that is the goal of life, if you stopped short of the second half of verse 3. But here, as the bridge to adulthood, the bridge to more than that, the bridge to humanity, which is the self-reflection of what matters, what it is that our shepherd asks from us. What he asks is to see ourselves walking alongside paths, even roundabouts, because it's not always clear. It's not linear, this path of justice. And that justice is a pursuit, the core pursuit of God. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Righteousness, this word in verse 3. Tzedek, tirdof, you shall pursue. That the journey of moving forward is to move forward towards justice for the sake of the divine name. With that is today's sharing. I have goosebumps, again, with an element of surprise of the relevance of this journey. This core popular Psalm 23 is more than just about comfort. It's also about challenge. And with that, I'm going to open it up for sharing just for 5 minutes. We can go over 5 because I got started late due to my computer glitch, to see if there's some sharing questions in regard to the first 3. Tomorrow, we'll look at verses 4, 5, and 6 and some of the artistry of the psalm. Some thoughts?
I was wondering if Magle might be translated as arcs, A-R-C-S.
Alex, now start again. I have to say it. Speak slowly.
Wondering if Magle might be translated as arcs, A-R-C-S.
I heard, what I heard, Alex, is a question about how else Ma'agle could be understood, and then I didn't catch what the other alternative word was.
Arcs, A-R-C-S. A-R-C-S, arcs.
Oh, arcs. Could it be seen as an arc, the arc of justice, that God leads me on arcs of justice? That's kind of a beautiful translation. I love that. And I love it both because of course, the famous line of MLK, that justice, about the bending of justice. But yes, because the image of an arc is circular. That's one that didn't occur to me. And I think that's a beautiful, maybe I'll even change it into arcs of justice rather than roundabouts. Because Ma'agle, I don't want it to feel like you're going in circles. I think I'm going to make that change. It's an excellent choice. Excellent choice. So I want to also emphasize what I love about that word Ma'agle, or the image of an arc. And that is, it's not the shortest route always to get to where you want to go. There's the story in the Talmud of a rabbi who stops a young boy and he says, how do I get to such a place? And the boy says, do you want me to tell you the long, short way or the short, long way? Which is to say, sometimes you got to go the longer route that will take you in the end less time than, if you will, the short route. That's not going to really get you there. So that image of Ma'agle Tzedek, the nature of justice, is a little bit of a walk, is I think embedded in the word Ma'agle Tzedek.
Rabbi?
Yes, Jerry.
This might be an obvious comment, but I guess everybody else picked up the fact that if you're going to use the translation as a roundabout or going around in order to get to your destination, it reminds, of course, of the 40 years in the desert.
Yes, exactly right. So the rabbis will also emphasize on that verse just that concept, namely that the people were not prepared to go directly, and therefore for them to get there, there needed to be a quality of maturation, at least of the next generation to mature, in order to own the responsibilities that came with sovereignty. And so yes, Ma'agle Tzedek is a reflection of God's judgment as the guide, with the fire by night and the cloud by day leading the people in the desert, that the way to get to the promised land was going to be circuitous. Yes, that too is embedded in that image in Psalm 23.
Rabbi, do you want to say one sentence maybe about why it is that the Christians put so much emphasis on this psalm and what their understanding is, as opposed to, I mean, I know you can't say Christians as one category, but what is it that they see here?
So I'm not sure, Jerry, in response to your question, And so I don't, on one hand, I want to say I'm not sure. We did see Psalm 22 last week as this remarkably Christian, it's the suffering servant with words that get echoed in the New Testament, in Mark and Matthew, of Jesus on the cross. So Psalm 22 is very central to Christian life, New Testament. Psalm 23, I don't think it's only because they're juxtaposed, but Psalm 23, is the image of grace, the image of the caring shepherd. And that is something that's very foreground in Christianity, the sense of you take on the offering of the sheep, which is Jesus, right?
Got it.
So this is a story of the Father with the Son and the sheep, which is the offering.
Got it.
And God is the shepherd, will ultimately be our guide, will give us that comfort, that safety. And so
Thank you.
that quality is very much central in Christian life and teaching.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, he's
welcome.
also known as the Good Shepherd. So the Good Shepherd, and anything that you see usually that has to do with shepherding, because they connect him because Moses was the shepherd, David shepherded the field. He is the Good Shepherd. Not that the others aren't Good Shepherds. So
referring to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's an image. Again, it's a beautiful image. The shepherd, who is the caregiver, who guides, who tends to every sheep. So it's a natural link. Mary, did Mary have your hand up a moment ago? Mary, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm reading the translation in the book from Yosef Yitzhak.
And okay, and how does that one read?
And it's strange on verse 3. He revives my soul. He directs me in paths of righteousness for the sake of his name.
Yeah.
So he leaves out that it's roundabout or straight, or
right.
He leaves out that. So I'm just wondering why that would be.
So again, a ma'agal can be a path. So you have multiple choices when you go to translate. It's part of my education in these days of looking at Psalms closely. And you can just choose to call it a path. You can look at the root, which has, again, this quality of a circular path. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that, which is why I said some people translate it as Harold Kushner did, as a straight path.
Okay.
But what they all share in common is, again, the notion of a path.
Yeah, and he uses righteousness instead of justice.
Well, those are synonyms, righteousness and justice. So they're both there. As I acknowledged, it is Harold Kushner who, at the very beginning of this lovely book that I do bring to your attention to read, he's in his first paragraph on this Psalm, verse 3, will say literally, ma'agle is a roundabout in terms of the closest to the literal level. But the challenge of all translation is, how literal do you want to be? And every language, of course, has different associations. It's why you don't get jokes, even if it's said in English, in other cultural settings, because what words mean can be very nuanced.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Rabbi Spitz, thank you so much for...
Rabbi Podwall, I'm going to give you the last Rabbi Podwall, and then we're going to pull it together, because I see my wife, Linda, who's going to say Kaddish at the end.
Well, we're so glad that you and Linda are back with us. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We really loved your zeroing in on tzedek, justice, righteousness. That was so beautiful. But quickly, a number of translations that I consulted on verse 3, nafshi, which we've been translating my soul, they point out that nefesh really means not so much soul, but breath or your very life. Nefesh is not necessarily soul, but something more material. Well, life, breath, or life, as opposed to soul in a few of the translations I consulted.
So I obviously that insight, Rabbi Podwal, also gives goosebumps. So let me say a word, because breath, of course, is very much on our minds in this moment as well. And the gift of breath as life. And so the word nefesh is literally life. And there are many, because nefesh is both breath, it's spirit, it's soul, it's all of those things. There are synonyms in Hebrew for soul and breath. So neshama is another example of breath and spirit. Nefesh, in the mystical understanding of layers of soul, is the most primal. It's the gift of life itself. So I'm going to pull this together. I shared that there's 4 different levels of reading a text. There's the immediate context, if you will, the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the intuitive. So the rabbis understood is the nature of soul. There's nefesh, ruach, neshama, and then chaya and yechida at the top, which is to say that this choice of word of nefesh is primal life, the ability to breathe. With every breath we take in life, the gift of life, which we ultimately as Jews see as the gift from God, and linked in that same verse of my breath, my soul, you revive, you, meaning it's a gift I receive from you, God, and its purpose is to lead me toward justice for your sake, not because it's expedient, not because it's good for me, but because there's a moral right and wrong, which is the very nature of divine justice. Tomorrow, I do look to regather, because Psalm 23 is so rich and so familiar, it warrants now looking at the second half. And in doing so, I did interpret-translate the last verse in a distinctive way. And I'll look to share with you that translation. But before we part, I want to invite my wife, Linda, who's now saying Kaddish for her mom, Sylvia, and others who are in mourning, to join together with our opportunity to perform the mitzvah of answering Amen. Kaddish Yatom, Mourners Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitdash be'raba
Amen.
aman ra kirute v'yamlich malchute v'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chaye d'chol beit Israel ba'agala v'zman kari v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Hey, Yitbarach v'yitabach v'yitmar v'yomam v'yitadar le'elam v'chata v'shirata v'chata v'nechamata v'randama v'rama min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu Amen.
Amen.
Say shalom b'ruma. Ya'aseh shalom aleinu yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks to each of you for joining together. There is more that we gain as community in all that we do. Be well, stay safe. Justice, justice you shall pursue.